Hi, Year 11. Today we'll be looking at the communication accommodation theory. Just to give you an idea of where this fits in the syllabus, here's our syllabus. So, nature of communication is what we're doing. We've done all these dot points, including all these dashes over the last few lessons, and we're up to this point here. Theories relating to intercultural communication. We have to choose one theory, and we're going to do this first one here, communication accommodation theory, so that's the heading you need to have in your books for today. The communication accommodation theory, CAT, also known as the speech accommodation theory, was first introduced in 1971 by Howard Giles. Giles dominated communication research during the late 1960s and 1970s, and his focus investigated on intergenerational communication and interpersonal skills. CAT explains that when we're in a room talking to a group of people with various social dimensions, such as differing ages, genders, ethnicities, occupations, etc., we become aware of these distinctive differences. And this impacts how we both send and receive information during our interactions. Giles really wanted to discover the reason why people change their behaviour when they speak to different people, and the consequences of the changes to their behaviour. So accommodation is really just the process of changing the way that you speak or talk to match the person you're speaking to. It might be to seek someone's approval, to maintain a positive social image, or in an attempt to communicate more effectively. The overriding concept of the theory is that during conversation, each participant will attempt to adjust their communication style to find a balance, and will do this by creating, maintaining, or decreasing social distance. The theory is concerned with the links between language, situational context, and personal identity. It is very aware of the socially and culturally embedded social constructs of power and impact this has on the communication process. Think about times where you've changed the way that you've spoken to others. For example, the way you speak to your grandparents isn't the same way that you speak to your friends. You might not incorporate the same sort of slang because you know that that isn't the sort of communication that they expect or that they may understand. I should probably also warn you now, I was feeling very memey when I made this PowerPoint, so get ready for more memes. When we engage in conversations with others, we bring our own similarities and differences. Without these differences in values, beliefs, and attitudes, communicators would have no reason to accommodate each other, which will make the theory void. However, we know that these differences exist, which makes it a valid theory. At the beginning of a conversation, normally within the first few seconds, communicators will judge the other. They will judge the person's speech, their behaviour, and determine whether or not they need to make accommodations in their own patterns of speech and behaviour, or whether to end the conversation. The way in which we perceive speech and behaviours of others determines our evaluation of the conversation, how effective it was, and whether or not we'll have a conversation with that person again in the future. When people from different cultures converse, it's common for them to agree to conduct the conversation from the social standing of the higher status person. This particularly links to language and the choice of language to use in a conversation. Normally, English takes that precedence. When we hear people speak with an accent, we might particularly start to over-accommodate for them. It might involve speaking slower, using more simple terms, which unfortunately can end up being quite patronising. The main strengths of applying the communication accommodation theory is that there are three easily recognised accommodation processes. These are either said to enhance or challenge the basic communication process. The first accommodation is convergence. Convergence is when a person positively adapts to meet the other person's characteristics. They reduce their differences so that there is more of a successful intercultural interaction. An example of this can be seen when person A mirrors similar postures, speech patterns, or hand gestures of person B while they're in a conversation. You will only see these actions when there is a level of respect, as a person will only accommodate if the other person has characteristics of value. Often convergence is socially expected due to the situation that participants are placed in, such as during job interviews. Here there would be clear examples of sender, job applicant, using convergence of both language and facial expressions in order to gain the recipient, potential employer's, approval. This can be seen in social settings in a high school as well. Think back to when we watched Mean Girls and the way that the main character Caddy changes the way she speaks and acts, her verbal and non-verbal communication methods when she's trying to fit in with the popular plastics group. The second type of accommodations that can be made is called divergence. This is where a person will deliberately emphasise their differences, not wishing to adapt to a situation. It might be done through creating physical distance from the people you're communicating with, or by deliberately using different sorts of language and non-verbal communication cues to what might be expected for the situation. Divergent actions can cause conflict, but they also often reinforce the socially respected positions of power and authority with the recipient. Divergence is commonly seen in the classroom when a teacher will physically diverge when standing in front of a misbehaving student's desk, looking down at them, for example. This places a clear visual marker between the teacher and the student, reminding the student of the teacher's authority in the classroom. This situation changes greatly if the teachers move to a more convergent stance of crouching down to talk to the student at eye level, communicating a more supportive partnership to the issue at hand. We can also see the use of divergence as a positive. A person may wish to enhance their pride in cultural differences, highlighting a positive in-group identity which needs to be accepted by other parties. Being able to use divergence in a variety of ways highlights a weakness in the application of this theory. It suggests that conversations are more complex than Giles implies. The final accommodation that can be made in this theory is over-accommodation. This is when we overdo our response to others in a form of excessive convergence, often making the recipient feel worse. Groups in which we tend to practice over-accommodation with are those with whom we misjudge as needing extra support during the conversation process. This commonly includes the elderly, those with disabilities, and women. Think mansplaining. Specific examples of over-accommodation could include only discussing quite simple topics, such as the weather, the use of basic grammatical phrases and structures, slowed speech, and being over-polite or caring. For example, fussing over another person. Patronising speech is a form of over-accommodation that is often used in intergenerational communication or with those who have physical and mental disabilities. I mentioned some of the strengths throughout this little video, but I'm just going to run through a couple of them in a little bit more detail now. The main strength of this theory is that it is strongly evidence-based. It uses the knowledge found within the realms of social psychology, basing itself on the main theories of assumption found within scientific study. Really, all this means is that we can call it universally true. We can apply this to different situations in different cultures, in different languages, for people of different ethnicities, over different time periods, and they will all agree that this theory is fact. The theory's core discussion of convergence and divergence makes it really easy to understand, and having a simple theory is a strength as well, because it enables increased access by people looking to understand the ways in which they communicate. While the theory is considered to be universally true, there are always going to be critics of any theory, and there are some identified weaknesses of the theory. For example, many of Giles's peers question if convergence-divergence is too much of a simplistic nature. Can we really downplay a whole theory into 3 simple processes? They also challenge the notion that people's accommodation can be explained by just the 2 practices of convergence and divergence. For example, what happens if you converge and diverge in the same conversation? How do we react? How do we analyze people who use both types of accommodation with the one communication? What, if any, influence does race and ethnicity have on this simultaneous process? There are lots of questions about the theory that haven't quite been answered yet. It also doesn't take into account things like sarcasm and other language tools, which people often use more so now in their day-to-day interactions with others. So, this has been a quick introduction to the communication accommodation theory. This could come up in your assessment task, so please make sure you have some notes on it. When you've finished taking notes of this video, please go back to Schoolbox and have a look at the due work. There are some questions for you to answer and submit at the end of this lesson.